It always created anxiety when clients set up and they said, I've got this one plan over here that handles 3 people and it's got 17 measurements and it requires these 2 other data feeds. You're just like, wait a minute, what? You're like, you want to spend $50,000 implementing 3 reps? I don't get it.
Yeah, let's put that one aside for a minute.
Sorry, I get all stressed out thinking about it.
Hi, I'm Scott Barton, and today I wish I knew more about how companies realize a return on their SPM software investments. SPM is the acronym for Sales Performance Management, and it offers a more sophisticated way to manage incentive compensation, territories, quotas, and other disciplines that are tied to Salesforce effectiveness and enablement. Well, our guest today is Rob Blohm. Rob is Chief Revenue Officer at Open Symmetry, a professional services firm dedicated to helping companies implement SPM software. Now, Rob, you've been focused on this space for over 25 years. You know it cold. Thanks for being here and teaching me a thing or two on this topic.
Sure.
Now, I know a lot of companies don't complete an ROI, and I imagine it can be a lot of work. A recent survey that I came across in researching this topic, so this was completed by the Sales Management Association in conjunction with Open Symmetry, and it reported that 25% of companies that had implemented SPM technology said they were unable to measure ROI. So what are the common issues that keep companies from measuring ROI, and how are the companies that do measure ROI able to work through those issues?
Yeah, a bunch of things come to my mind when we talk about ROI and realizing ROI. One of the things that we're huge fans of is when you build out your business case for your implementation or your purchase of an SPM application, that there's traceability from that business case all the way through the project, right? So if you're trying to realize an ROI on a more cost-effective process, less headcount, lower error rates, you need to make that part of the requirements, part of the design. And then you need to come back at the end of the project and say, okay, can we trace back to the original business case and have we achieved that business case? Honestly, I don't see a lot of companies, or at least a lot of companies I've worked with, do that. You get that business case completed, you get the sign off, and then you're off to the races. And that can be a problem because if you don't have that visibility into why we made the investment and make that part of the argument for the go forward, you'll lose sight of it. And then someone will invariably come back and say, hey, did we get our business case? And you're sort of shrugging your shoulders because there's all this stuff in between getting approval and going live that will take you away from potentially what people want to know on the actual ROI achieved. That would be my sort of initial reaction just based on the projects I've been part of.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk more about, some of these areas of value and the degree to which you can really tie numbers to them. And in the area, what I think is really core to SPM is payment accuracy and timeliness. You'd mentioned transparency. And one of the things I heard you say was around, expense reduction when, some of the expenses from overpayments, which isn't something that reps typically report, right? They're not going to say, hey, you overpaid me, $20,000 this quarter. Please take it back. So how do you get at, what is a good benchmark for reducing overpayment expenses? Is it as simple as just assuming, look, it's going to be kind of equal to what our underpayments are, that reps, we know about those, right? Reps say, hey, you didn't pay me this. And, those that get reconciled by management are the ones, that we end up accounting for. So yeah, how do we come up with a good benchmark for reducing our overpayment expense?
Yeah, unless you're going to dig into, in my mind, Scott, and I don't have a ton of experience with that specific topic, but I guess unless you're going to dig into and complete audits pre-deployment and then come back and do another audit post-deployment, I don't know that you would know if you're getting better. And oftentimes, if you have a heavy manual process, right? If you're on Excel or doing something like that, there's obviously human error. There's there's those challenges. If you've got a manual or kind of an automated process, homegrown system or what have you, oftentimes, the errors are within the data itself that are flowing into the system, right? We're miscrediting or overcrediting or whatever that might be. So whether you have an SPM system or not, those issues in the data may not be identified or fixed just because you're automating the program. So, I mean, it kind of goes back to if that's one of the pillars of your ROI or your business case, then you really do need to go figure out, okay, how are we going to attack that to make sure that we're doing better. Now, I would offer that a great example of a company I worked with actually when I was actually implementing these systems is they used the SPM implementation as a way to clean up a lot of I would say subjective policies that the companies they acquired had put in place, right? And so just as the backdrop here is it's a mortgage company. They bought a ton of mortgage brokerages. And as they were folding them into the organization, they allowed them to, keep their manual processes and keep these old comp plans. And with the introduction of an SPM application during the implementation, we were forcing them into a more structured construct by which they needed to pay out of. And it was always funny to me because they'd come back and go, "Oh, you're mispaying us on this," and they're like, "No, we're actually paying you correctly now." And so that was always entertaining, when you used SPM to drive business process improvement or, business, what do you call that? More standardization, right? So, I mean, there's a couple different ways you can definitely attack it, Scott. But unless you go dig into those details early and then come back and look at those exact same details to see if you've affected change in the way you want, I think it might be tough.
One of the things I heard you say earlier, or I think I heard you say, was on the comp admin headcount, and if we're focused on payment accuracy, let's say, just making that whole process work more smoothly, I would assume that a big part of the benefit would be less comp admin headcount. So what is the issue with that? Why isn't that? And I think I heard you said that it isn't often included in the ROI, that we're going to reduce the number of heads that are administering our sales comp admin.
Yeah, I think there is I don't know of a misconception, but I think there is a expectation, right? That if we're introducing technology, we're gonna create operational efficiencies. We don't need the number of hours and things like that. But the reality, from what we've seen, not only from survey research as well as just anecdotally working with all these companies, is that unless you have over 2,000-3,000 payees, oftentimes what we find is that you're not going to reduce your headcount just because you're introducing a sales compensation tool. What we would argue, or what we would offer, that if you implement this application correctly, you will have more effective and efficient resources on the team. So I'm kind of going in a circle here, but my thought is that if I have 3 administrators managing sales compensation for 400 sales reps, oftentimes they're going to have to continue to do that same job, whether it's on Excel or on an SPM application. So you're not really going to reduce anything. What you might be able to do, though, is make their jobs a little easier so that they can become less tactical and more strategic. So instead of crunching incredibly long hours at the end of the pay cycle, maybe their time is spread more evenly across the administration because now they're working with the system more proactively to make sure that pay is going out on time versus trying to crush through everything in Excel later. That said, if you have obvious inefficiencies or obviously you have a high level of manual intervention or manual management of the SPM program, you would see efficiencies, right? And a great case study, Scott, actually was one of the Varicent clients, a really, really big organization up in Minneapolis. I think they had 30 comp administrators managing sales comp for 4,000 reps across all these spreadsheets. And they were actually able to drop that from 30 down to about 5. And so, that's a little bit of an extreme, but, there are opportunities out there where you can take advantage of these applications to get rid of laborious manual processes. So I think every situation is unique. You got to look at it differently and say, hey, are we actually going to reduce headcount, or are we going to make these people more effective? And again, it's a case by case.
Yeah, and certainly there's value in a smaller organization if you have 3 administrators, and that's just a bad experience for them, and
Right.
they're likely to disengage in the extreme quit. Well, certainly, you want to be able to avoid that situation, and there's value in keeping them there and making the job a little more enjoyable. Rob, one of your sweet spots is on the implementation, so let's talk about that. And obviously ROI is tied to the cost and the timing of the implementation. So, what's your advice for clients to be able to realize a timely and cost-effective implementation? And what are the lessons that you've learned from those projects that have gone sideways?
I learned a couple. I hope I have. Yeah, I think the old adage, keep it simple, goes a long way on any enterprise software implementation, especially with SPM. I think that there's some big challenges with implementing SPM, because usually there's a lot of different people involved, right? I mean, it's not just one or two groups. It's often HR, it's IT, it's sales ops, it's finance. There's a lot of moving parts when it comes to implementing sales compensation systems, and emotions run really, really high on this because you're dealing with people's pay. And then when you equate that to sales performance and a company's strategic capability of hitting their sales objectives, the whole thing gets gets a lot of attention. So I think one of the things that I'm always a huge advocate of, as I said earlier, just keeping it as simple as you can, right? And stepping in with the realization that you may not be able to do everything on the first pass. And so if you approach it with sort of that mentality of, hey, how are we going to get the biggest bang for the buck on our first rollout, or our first effort, if you will? How can I get 80% of the work done for 20% of the total cost? You can allow yourself an opportunity to get some quicker wins, get live faster, and then come back after you've learned some things. Your team is more experienced on the application, and maybe start folding in those other groups that were the one-offs, the challenge babies. The folks that have the really squirrely plan, or you're dependent on that data feed that's not clean, or they have massively complex reporting requirements. Let's just go with, hey, if we go back to our business case, what is it we need to achieve? Let's focus on that, what we can done in a very simple manner, and then we can step into the more complex stuff. I mean, I'm a huge fan of that, and I think that's probably because I did 4 or 5 years project managing these systems, and it always created anxiety when clients set up and they said, I've got this one plan over here that handles 3 people, and it's got 17 measurements, and it requires these 2 other data feeds. You're just like, wait a minute, what? You're like, you want to spend $50,000 implementing 3 reps? I don't get it.
Yeah,
So
let's put that one aside for a minute.
sorry, I get all stressed out thinking about it.
Yeah, but okay, so that's interesting because I've observed that these solutions have gotten a lot more complex in terms of the number of things that or the number of problems they'll help to solve. So you're saying, look, don't try to bite all of that off at once. Phase it. But with the additional capabilities that are inherent in some of these applications, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and the like, I mean, has it gotten easier or more difficult for your teams, to implement these solutions, and for companies to recognize the value over time?
Well, yeah, I mean, the more functionality, the more capabilities that are rolled out with these applications, it's you have to increase your skill sets on the implementation side of our house to make sure that we're appropriately walking into these implementations in a manner that we're actually providing value, right? Not just from paving the cow path, saying, okay, give me your reports, give me your analytics, and we'll just build that, but being a little bit more consultative to say, hey, this is the ultimate business goal. How do we achieve that, right? How do we leverage this system to get there? And so a great case in point, Scott, is and one of the reasons I like more of a stepped approach is that clients will see analytics, right? They'll see these amazing analytical dashboards and artificial intelligence, and the thought is, hey, we want to make that part of the first phase, and we need to have that rolled out. Well, in practical sense, if you wait and maybe attack that in phase two, what that gives you is the advantage of having the data in the system, having some basic reports, and having the opportunity to look at that data and look at what is being presented from the standard reports and say, okay, how do we build off of that? And what that will give you is an opportunity to actually dig into the data a little bit more before you sort of say, well, we know this is the dashboard we want, so just go build it. It's like, well, why don't we learn as we go? And that way that dashboard is going to be that much smarter as it relates to what it's going to be able to provide you. So I may be oversimplifying that a bit, but I think there's logic in taking a stepped approach and putting the building blocks in place before you start stacking additional building blocks on top of that.
Yeah. You're I think explaining why many of these implementations are seemingly long, multiple months. Some can go over a year because there's a lot of value there to untap. But to realize it, you've got to phase and stage things. So it isn't something, again, given the sophistication and complexity of these, that you're just going to quickly implement it if you want to get the value from it. Now, Rob, assuming I've secured the budget for my project, what are some of the things that we haven't talked about yet that will help my organization realize sufficient value from the SPM solution, even if I'm not there to measure? If I'm the project manager, I've moved on, or maybe, more importantly, let's say the executive sponsor has moved on. So for all the rest of the team that's involved in this, what do they need to keep front and center to ensure they can demonstrate value from this investment?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think there's multiple facets you can probably explore on that, but the hot topic for me lately is ensuring self-sufficiency, or at least the level of self-sufficiency a company wants to achieve. And the reason I bring this up is, a lot of times you go through these sales cycles and you see these applications, and the sales reps, I'm not picking on anybody specifically, but the sales reps will say, hey, it's easy to use. It's gonna enable the business team, and they won't be dependent on IT and all this other stuff. And it's like, that's true to a degree, but there is some work that goes into getting to that level. And I think where clients fail to recognize, or at least fail to understand, is that there's a direct tie between being competent on your application and then ensuring you're realizing the value from the application. Because if you don't create some level of competency, if you don't become self-sufficient, at least in the processes and in the facets that you need, the value of that application, the value of that implementation is going to degrade over time, or is going to be less intriguing because now you're dependent on an external resource to come in and help you in an ad hoc manner. And so, and again, this is kind of a hot topic for me, Scott. I actually just worked with my team to put a white paper together on it. And it's all about creating a realistic expectation for managing SPM post-deployment, right? And what really needs to go into that process or that implementation during the actual configuration time to make sure that you come out of the back end feeling good about the application. And I think if you do make those investments, if you recognize what you want to own coming out of the deployment and make inroads to get there, it's going to, by virtue, come back and provide value, or allow the application and the investment to provide value going forward, right? It won't be that just initial shock of, oh, we got new reports, we got this. It's the ongoing opportunity to use that system, to improve it, and to continue to see value. That's the big one for me. And again, Scott, it's kind of top of mind just because we've been putting a lot of effort into that paper. So
yeah, there's a lot to this, and at the same time, I think a lot of people that are coming into this space new have just this inherent, need for instant gratification, and it's not what we're talking about here. Just the management discipline of sales employees and pay is complex in its own right. So if you're really going to scale things and make big gains, you got to go into it being very thoughtful. So really appreciate your time, Rob. I always learn a lot when I speak with you, and certainly know more from this conversation than I did before it. All right, last question. So what's a topic you wish you knew more about that would help you to be more effective in your role? Now, full disclosure to our audience, we asked this question and intend to be spontaneous about it and the answer. But you and I did cheat on this a bit when I saw you earlier in the week in Chicago. And I asked you the question, and I kind of predicted your response, and that you would look at me with a blank stare and say, well, I don't know. There isn't anything that I wish I knew more about. But come on, you've had a few days now to think about this. So what do you wish you knew more about that's related to your job?
Joking aside, I think I just struggle with that question because I think there's so much that kind of comes to mind that I wish I could dig into. I think the one thing that is sort of interesting to me is there's an old adage from a friend of mine, Danya Rose, said SPM, if done correctly, provides an intersection between plan design and execution. And I think that was kind of an interesting way to phrase it. And that is one area that I'm constantly trying to figure out and try to learn more about, is how do we make these SPM applications more valuable from a plan design, plan strategy standpoint, right? I mean, we talk about the idea that when you go into a plan design review, whether you use an external consultancy like AGI or you do an internal, there's a lot of work, right, that goes into looking at the pay performance data and understand if it's actually driving the right behaviors, if you're getting the right results from your plans. And so for me, that's always an interesting topic in that, companies, I think, can see a ton of value from that, but it's an area that very few companies tap into. And so from my mind, if I could better understand how to make that connection and articulate it, and then as a result, relate that back into the deployment, I think it would be very interesting. I feel like I would be more effective for my clients in saying, yes, we're implementing this because we got to get good reports out and get accurate pay and more timely and all that. But, when we talk about forecasting and accruals and all that fun stuff, that's becoming more table stakes, but it's really that design strategy in SPM that I feel like, I wish I knew more on that topic so I could be more insightful or more hopeful.
Fair enough. So your deer in the headlights stare wasn't because you know everything. It's just that this is such a big, complex topic that no one could ever nail it, and there's always lots to learn.
Yeah, I mean, the more you learn, the more you don't know, and that's kind of where I'm at.
Good point. Well, thank you again. I want to thank the audience and remind those who haven't yet subscribed to please subscribe. Please let us know your comments. We read those, we use them, and we'll see you again soon.